Join us for Book Beat, Sundays at 5 p.m., repeated Mondays at 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. Our guest is Norman Draper, author of BackYard and FrontYard. Please join us then. Hello and welcome to Book Beat. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny, and I'll be your host today. Our guest is Norman Draper, author of BackYard and FrontYard. Welcome, Norman.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you give our viewers a flavor of BackYard and FrontYard without giving away too much?
Sure. BackYard and FrontYard are both humorous novels about gardening. Now that might sound kind of strange and unique, and I believe it is. What I'm trying to do is write novels that make people laugh while having a sort of specialty area. This particular specialty area happens to be gardening. And what these books are about are obsessive suburban gardeners. In the first book, BackYard, what we have as a backdrop is a very big gardening competition that everybody wants to win. Our heroes of the book are a couple of sort of normal suburbanites who have found some way to create these luxuriant, beautiful gardens. Nobody else quite knows how they've been able to do it. I suspect they do it through heart, just by love of what they're doing. What happens is it creates a great deal of jealousy among the other members of the gardening community who think they should be the ones who win the contest and be declared the greatest gardeners in Livia, which is our fictional suburban community. So gradually, as our couple, George and Nan Fremont, work to make their backyard better and better and better for this contest, we have various and sundry people trying to wreck their efforts. Now, they try to do this by various means, one of which is sabotage, gardening sabotage. The other is a supernatural, the use of witchcraft, actually, to destroy the gardens.
Okay.
So it builds up to a climax of the contest. And who is going to win the contest despite all these efforts to destroy the Fremont's gardens?
Oh, that sounds like fun. And what about FrontYard?
FrontYard it's the sequel to BackYard, but it's a little bit different in that the Fremonts, having finished their backyard, now turn their attention to their much neglected front yard. So we have a major effort toward fixing their front yard up and making it beautiful. In the meantime, there is a plot that is going on that has to do with what is under the ground.
Oh.
And in this case, we're not sure, and this is where I'm in danger. I'm going to try not to reveal too much. But it has to do with something of great value, buried underneath. Now we're going back to the backyard again. Buried underneath the backyard, we bring in more characters who maybe don't have so much to do with gardening, but are interested in artifacts, treasure, who knows, that's buried underneath the backyard. So that has a slightly different storyline from the original book.
Okay. You mentioned a little bit about it being a book that makes people laugh. You described the book as comedy, but do you have any other descriptors to elucidate the genre?
It's kind of difficult. I mean, you could call it a gardening book because there's a lot of gardening and there are many, many gardening details in the book. And in fact, the gardening part of it is a fairly serious part of it because I garden. I love flowers. This is flower gardening as opposed to food gardening. And my wife is a dedicated gardener. So I wanted to put part of my love of gardening in this book. So we have a very heavy gardening element in it. The rest is a rather broad slapstick comedy. So if I had to pick a genre, I'd probably pick humor over gardening.
Okay.
Because it's meant to make people laugh. The gardening elements are meant to make people interested either in something they already do as gardeners or something they're interested in exploring. I've tried to make the gardening appear somewhat exotic so that people who don't know about gardening might take an interest in it and want to know more about it.
What in your background and experience led you to write these books? You mentioned that you are an avid gardener. Anything else?
Well, yes. I've been a writer all my life, primarily as a newspaper reporter. I've been a newspaper, well, not anymore, but my entire professional career has been spent as a newspaper reporter for different newspapers throughout the country, most recently with the Star Tribune for 25 years. As a sort of an antidote to that, I've been writing fiction on kind of a parallel track to that. So I have my newspaper writing, which I have done as a professional, and then I'd go home and write fiction. Initially short stories and humorous sketches, then moving on to novels, the first two of which I wrote had nothing to do with gardening. I started writing novels around 1998, and then after those two novels, I decided to maybe give the gardening angle a try. And the whole idea of enjoying your backyard for its birds and its flowers and whatever else you might find there if you're willing to pay attention to it. So I'm not sure it's an area of my wife is the one with the expertise, but I am the one with the interest, and I'm always asking her, what flower is this and why are we planting it here, over and over and over again, just so it gradually, I absorb it sort of through osmosis.
Yes, that's something that I would do too. I have to hear it over and over again to grasp exactly when it's a subject matter that I'm not real familiar with.
Yeah, my wife thinks I'm a little slow, I think, but I do a lot of the basic labor for her as she's planting. I haul the dirt, I dig the holes, and then she explains to me, well, here's what this is doing, and here's why we're planting it there, you know, in shade or in light, which can be a very difficult thing to try to figure out, especially since you're planting a lot of your flowers when the trees haven't fully come out yet. So you have to kind of remember where the shade and light are going to be.
Let's take a little turn. Let's talk about character development in your book.
Okay.
Were any of the characters modeled after real people, or did you come to them through your own experience?
I base, at least consciously, none of my characters on real people for several reasons. One, I want to create my own characters. I consider that my characters are made from whole cloth. Of course they're going to be based on people. When you live 64 years, you're going to be meeting people and having experiences, good and bad, with people, and they're all going to get kind of mushed together, you know, in your brain and in your creative efforts. So they do all come out, you know, somehow in your books, including parts of yourself and maybe parts of your spouse or whatever. In fact, there are occasions when subconsciously I have come a little too close to actually basing them on real people. One of the characters in BackYard, as I went over in my revision, I found out I had the name of a former boss of mine.
Oh my goodness.
One of the characters. It was a good character. It wasn't a villain. Nevertheless, I thought, I have to change this. Then a reader, a friend of ours, I had another character, and she had a common name, but it was spelled in a strange way. Well, it was her spelling of that name. And she said, oh, you based that character on me? And said, honestly, I did not. but somehow this name got lodged, and the odd spelling of the name got lodged in my subconscious. So it just came out.
Oh my goodness.
And so I don't intend to do that. And the characters are really, as much as I can have them be, independent of any real people.
I was especially interested in Dr. Phyllis Sprout. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about Dr. Sprout without, again, giving away a whole lot of the plot?
Sure. Dr. Phyllis Sprout is, if you had to have a villain of the books, it would be Dr. Phyllis Sprout. She is a very pedantic sort of person. Her approach to gardening is completely academic, with virtually, and cold-hearted, with no heart involved, which is what our heroes, the Fremonts, have the opposite of. They have all heart and no pedantic learning. So you have a character here who's thinking that gardens must be this way, and anybody else who does it differently is a fool. Not only that, but she sees herself as the expert in gardening in the community of Livia, and cannot stand the idea that somebody else might be doing these things better than she is. So she is as close to what we have as an evil character here. She's humorously evil, and she does have her good points, which I liked her enough to want to give her a couple of good things. One is that she recognizes beauty. She recognizes deep down that what she's doing is not good enough, and what the Fremonts, who do things from their heart, is doing is superior to hers. The bad part of the character says, this is awful, and I'm going to make them pay for it. But she does recognize the quality of what they're doing. Now, when you have such a villainous character as this, it gives you all kinds of opportunities to create humor. So she is, I think, the person who creates some of the most humorous situations in the book. Our heroes, George and Anne Fremont, are kind of the straight people, you know, playing off the humorous antics of Dr. Sprout and the Confederates that she enlists. She's the one, well, I better not say this, but anyway, she comes up with a lot of sort of strange ways to try to ensure that she will win the contest and not the Fremonts. But you're right, I think she may be my favorite character in the book, although I do like the Fremonts also. They are the most normal people, perhaps, in the book, if there are such characters. The reason being is, in the Fremonts, I was trying to create characters who you would love to have as your neighbors. People who are nice, who are kind, even though they have no visible means of support, who always are creating a beautiful, maintain their property immaculately, beautiful gardens, and always have their tipplers. They like to drink. And they always have an extra glass of wine out there for you in case you happen to pop by. They will have you sit down and have a drink and have pleasant conversation with you. I like them for that reason, but they are no contest to Phyllis Sprout when it comes to really some wacky and strange things that really help fuel the plot of the book.
I found it so interesting to see them placed next to each other, and it gave a good, I don't know what the word is, but almost a foil against one against the other.
Very much so, yeah.
And talking about gardens, do you have gardening experience?
Yes, I do have experience. If you were to talk to a master gardener, they probably would not consider it vast experience, but I have the experience of practice and knowing what I like and knowing what I like to plant. As I mentioned, I'm with my wife. In fact, you know, we do gardening work now almost every day, some of which I do, I must admit, reluctantly. But we do quite a lot of that and have been doing for months, you know, having now our midsummer flowers coming out. But I've been doing this for years and years. We take trips to the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. I did use some books to help me research this about flowers in the Midwest. And a friend of mine is a master gardener. A friend of mine who was a newspaper reporter colleague at the Star Tribune is also a master gardener. I used her as a sounding board when I was writing these books. And in fact, she was an editor for both manuscripts, going over them for any faux pas I might have committed that people in the gardening community might have said, how could he be that stupid? Even when you're writing silly and ridiculous, and I hope very funny books, I want to make sure my gardening facts were straight. You can create very ridiculous situations, yet there are certain things that you want to make sure are correct. And she was there to read through several drafts of each manuscript to make sure I was doing it right. And to say, no, not that flower. I think for this purpose you want to substitute this one. There are, without spoiling things, there are some potentially dangerous, shall we say, plants in these books. And at first I had another one, and she said, no, 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 you don't want that one. You want this one. So I said, okay.
Oh, that sounds like fun. So you did do some research,
Yes.
but a lot of it came out of practice and experience.
Yes, and then you have, as a novelist, you have simple research that you have to do that's not necessarily topic specific. For instance, I have one character with her high heels on trying to run across a muddy yard, and I have to ask my wife, is this possible for a woman to do? Is it possible for a woman to run across a mud-soaked field in high heels? And she said, probably not. And so I have to say, okay, she's going to be having to trip and fall and look even more ridiculous than I have her. So there are all kinds of other sorts of research that you have to do just in the course of doing your character things, and not exclusively involving gardening.
Okay. Let's take another turn. Would you talk about your writing practices?
Sure.
What do you do? Do you write every day? Do you plot characters on a timeline? What do you do?
Well, first thing I do is just start writing. I'm a believer that you get your inspiration by sitting down and making it come. It can come to you in various guises, if you're thinking about things. I mean, you're always thinking about characters and things like that. But to me, you have to sit down and pound it out, even if it's not coming to you. Because to me, as a writer, as a novelist, you're a professional. You don't sit around and wait for the inspiration to come to you. You sit down and start writing, which is where my newspaper career helped me out quite a bit. You didn't have a whole lot of time to go into an anguish. How is this? You have a deadline and you have to have it done by that particular time. Same with writing novels. So I have I wouldn't call it a regular schedule, but it is, as I'm writing novels, and I'm actually working on 2 right now, a daily schedule. So I try to get between, anywhere between 2 and, 6 hours is stretching it, but it has gone to 6 hours every day. It's not to say I don't miss some days, I do. Life interferes. But to me, it's important to not wait for inspiration, but to go there daily and sweat it out. And a lot of times, believe me, it is sweating it out. You just have to sit there, and even if you write something that's awful, it's really important to get it out. As you're writing the first draft of your book, you really have to get a structure for your book. So, and that's simply getting from point A to point B to point C and not going all of a sudden to point M. But to just, that's how I visualize it, is I'm going here to here, then I go to here. I don't outline my books ahead of time, which drives my agent crazy. He says, you need to outline, and I said, I do not. This is how I write. And then once you get maybe to point D or E, you start seeing ahead where things, or actually I should say, that's not always the case, because in the book I'm working on now, the ending appeared to me fairly early. In fact, the ending appeared to me as well as the beginning without any middle. So,
oh dear.
So I had, okay, the ending, okay, I've got a pretty good idea what that's going to be. And I've got a pretty good idea what the beginning's going to be. Of course, all this can be thrown into a cement mixer and come out concrete, you know, I mean, or it can just not work at all. You know, it sort of depends. As you're writing, and this is where the muse does occasionally take over, and all of a sudden you find the words just spilling out, and you've done 5 pages in 20 minutes, and they just, you know? And then you say, well, this really messes things up in terms of my plan. You have to go with that. You have to go with that, and then sort of reconstruct everything. In terms of other practices, I work in an office. It is semi-dark, and I don't want anybody bothering me at all. I get up generally at 4:30 in the morning when I'm writing a novel, try to write for 2 to 2.5 hours before my wife wakes up, or she just quit her job, she'd be out the door, and I'd have all this time to write in complete solitude and quiet. I view writing a novel as a solitary experience where you are alone with your vision of what you want to write, and if you give yourself enough time, that will happen as long as you keep allowing it. And for some reason, I used to find the lunch hour is a good time to write too. Don't know why. Afternoon, something about my biorhythms just doesn't. If I have to, I can do it, but it is twice as hard to write then.
Interesting. How do you do that?
Typewriter is, that's how I started, but it's kind of out of the picture now.
Okay.
I keep 2 of them around just for old time's sake, and that's how I started writing fiction on typewriters, but I've succumbed to the lure of modern technology. I do, however, write longhand.
Oh.
And to do my composing, I'm at the keyboard, but then what I like to do is print out a number of pages and then go over them longhand.
Okay.
And then if I'm really going, I can, and sometimes on trips, we've been taking trips to my wife's home in Nebraska, and during some breaks in the action, this is to visit her hospitalized mother, during some breaks in the action, I will go into the cafeteria and just spend an hour just doing nothing but making corrections, which inevitably leads to writing new sections of the chapter. I will do it in longhand and fill up an entire couple of blank pages, then bring them home and try to read them, and then type them all into the computer. So it's a combination of longhand and computer.
Okay. Do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Yes, I think I do. I don't view myself as somebody who can really teach writing, because to me, writing is something that comes from your vision and your experience, and who am I to interfere with that? However, I think to become a writer, and my expertise, well, I've done plenty of nonfiction writing as well, but in terms of fiction writing, I think 2 simple words: read, write. You have to be someone who reads. I don't see any way out of it. Read, 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 read some more. Read what you want to read, learn what other people you respect think is good. Read that, force yourself to read it. Then write. You have to write, 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 and keep writing. There's just no way out of it. There, I think, are a lot of people who talk and think about writing and who somehow never get around to it. And I think if you're going to be a writer, especially a fiction writer, you will find that your computer is like a magnet for you. You can't, even if you don't want to write, it will always be pulling you toward it. And if you feel that way, then you should be a writer. If you have to be told to do that, you're probably not. So I think writing is sort of part of the persona of people who are going to be writers. And if they ask about it and they're already doing it, then there's nothing I can give them advice about. There are, however, there is some advice I can give them for once they've finished the process and want to figure out what to do with it. The first is rewrite. Rewrite, 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 never stop rewriting. I mean, you could go through 7 or 8 drafts of a 350-page novel and not be ready to send it off even to your literary agent. Get a literary agent. Most publishers do not accept manuscripts from authors. You go through established literary agents who then, their job is to sell the book for you. That is, in many ways, the hardest part about selling a book. Once you get an established literary agent, your chances of selling a book improve dramatically. However, it is really hard to get a literary agent. In BackYard, I queried 130 literary agents before I finally got one to take me on.
Oh, wow.
So you have to also embrace failure, because for most authors, not all, but for most authors, failure will be 90% of your effort. You will get rejected over and over and over and over again. Many times people won't even bother to answer your query. You just have to fight your way through it, embrace it, laugh at it, look forward to your eventual success, and just if you want to quit early, it's not the line of work for you. Because I wrote 2 novels that never sold. I had to accept that they were practice novels, and then keep on writing. If your urge is telling you to keep on doing it, then you are a writer, no question about it.
Would you like to read some things from your book?
I'd be happy to.
Some selections.
I'd be happy to, and I've got a selection from each book. The first one will be from the first book, and they are in sequence. BackYard and FrontYard, although you can read them independently if you like. This features your favorite character, Dr. Phyllis Sprout. And it occurs at the beginning of BackYard. We have as a background this contest I mentioned that it hasn't been officially announced, but everybody's found out about it anyway. And Dr. Sprout has, of course, found out about it and is worried, has noticed the Fremonts' beautiful gardens, and wants to see more of them surreptitiously. Dr. Sprout was trespassing. It was for the greater good that she did so, but the fact remained that here she was, prowling around in somebody's backyard without first obtaining permission. She hadn't trespassed since she was a little girl. That was when she ran up to that spooky old unkempt house with the peeling paint and overgrown shrubs at the end of Cullen Street to look in the windows. Then she figured she'd be able to see once and for all if Miss Fearington really was a banshee. Marta Poppendauber and Jenny Burlingame stood back at a safe distance, egging her on. Jenny had overheard her parents call Miss Fearington a strumpet, which Marta said was a type of banshee from Germany that ate small children. That confirmed their suspicions that the house, which always seemed deserted and emitted an eerie red glow, was a banshee den. Just as little Phyllis was poised to peek through the window into the red room, Miss Fearington, very obviously not a banshee, but just as scary nonetheless, threw open her front door. She was dressed only in her bra and panties with a filmy camise barely draped over her shoulders and was jiggling body parts like a Jell-O shaker jamboree. She yelled at Phyllis about being a peeping Tapacina, and what did she think she was doing? Phyllis hightailed it so fast she passed Jenny and Marta, who were screaming and throwing up their hands like a couple of born-again somethings, and ran into a tree which had left a knot on her forehead for 2 weeks. 52 years later, here she was with Marta, deep into the backyard of people she had not so much as been introduced to, and without even an implied invitation. She knew they were the Fremonts, and what they were doing might well pose a clear and present danger to the venerable institution of gardening in Livia. As far as she could tell, no one was home, so what was the harm in doing a bit of nosing around? She tugged on the hem of Marta's short-sleeved blouse. "Come on," she said. "Come on," Marta said. "Come on where?" "Why, we're going to inspect this yard from top to bottom. We're sleuths, backyard spies. Won't that be fun, Marta?" Marta cringed and gently pulled away from her. "Wimp," thought Dr. Sprout. "I'm stuck with a wimp who has no stomach for the gardening espionage business." If only Jenny were here now. But of course, Jenny could not be here with her now, having passed away in her garden 2 years ago. She had been stricken with a mortal stroke as she was weeding the area around her Asiatic lilies, balloon flowers, and purple cone flowers, just as they were bursting out in all their late July glory. Her husband, Doob, had found her lying face up. A limpid smile creased her face. The 5-inch teeth of her weed fork pointed heavenward. She was one for the ages, that Jenny was, and died with her gardening clogs on. What a trooper. "But can't we just look from here? This is private property." "So?" Dr. Sprout clenched her jaw and clutched at Marta's blouse again. "So? Little scruples apply to little people, Marta. We are not little people, and we are here on a higher mission. Trust me, the end will justify the means." "Please don't tear my blouse, Doc Phil," Marta whined. Doc Phil, Doc Phil. Dr. Phyllis Sprout hated the name, even worse than she hated dandelions and root rot. "Dr. Sprout, please, Marta," she said, releasing her pinch hold. She gazed upon Marta with contempt. She had been all agog about coming with her and checking out these Fremonts, Dr. Sprout reflected angrily. Now her natural timidity threatened to ruin the whole project. Now I have to look and see where I was. Here we are. Look at her in that stupid little floral print blouse with renderings of 5 particular plants and their names in notebook script spattered over it. How presumptuous to be wearing such a thing. It was as if she wanted to tell the world she was some sort of queen of the gardeners. Why, she, Dr. Phyllis Sprout, was the one who laid out Marta's first garden and taught her the rudiments of soil preparation, proper mix of plants and fertilization. And now her gardens were a mess. She had committed the cardinal sin of allowing unwanted and contemptible genera to spread uncontrolled throughout her yard. It was horticultural hodgepodgery, that's what it was. What if somebody's at home? Dr. Sprout flinched as if she had just been buzzed by a passing wasp. What if they were home? What if they came running out the door, armed with trowels, pitchforks, and razor-edged spades to turn these brazen trespassers into human plant mulch? Dr. Sprout squinted as she studied their back door. There was no sign of life. No light shone through the uncovered windows. She would instruct Marta to keep a wary eye on the street in case someone pulled into the driveway, forcing them to duck for cover behind a tree or a bush. It was time to get moving and to get scared little Marta moving with her. "So what are you, Marta, a fraidy cat?" That's the excerpt from BackYard.
Oh my goodness, that sounds like an interesting start to a fun novel.
That's the start of the conflict we have, and it comes pretty early on in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're going to leave Dr. Phyllis Sprout behind for a little bit, and we visit George and Nan Fremont at the beginning of book number 2. This they've decided to start working on their front yard again. We won't reveal what happens in backyard that sort of leads to all this. But we have a new situation here, and that is, what is underneath all the flowers and roots, and why is there so much interest in it? You mean to tell me a man was killed in our backyard? Nan's knees buckled. She propped herself against the front counter and gripped its ledge hard. Having steadied herself, she pivoted away from the woman at the information counter to stare goggle-eyed at George. George was doing his speak no evil impression by clamping his hand over his mouth and chin, thusly. He did that when he couldn't decide whether to be astonished, scared, or completely indifferent. Nan wished he would stop. It make him look like such a dolt. But this. It was disturbing enough that their placid and orderly little oasis at one time harbored thickets of weeds, natural grasses gone wild, and shrubs and trees growing and multiplying by nature unchained. To now be told that it was the scene of a violent death, why, it was unthinkable. Well, we don't actually know that for a fact, said the historian, a Miss Price. Miss Price's baleful glaze had challenged them to approach her as they sauntered into the Livia Historical Society. Livia is the name, by the way, as an aside, of the suburb in which all these people live. Mm-hmm. During one of the few times it was open to visitors, 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. on the third Saturday of the month, alternating months, even-numbered years only. But we are reasonably certain that two men associated with Sieur de La Salle, Messrs. Boyer and Ducharme, departed from La Salle's main group at some point. They might have made their way to Livia and camped out in the vicinity of Bluegill Pond. The best place to camp along Bluegill Pond would have been on the east side, on top of the rise on which your house now stands. This guy was actually killed on our property, George said. Whoa. Yeah, said Nan. Who was this La guy? La Salle, the French explorer. Oh, that La Salle, George said. Sure, the guy who canoed the Mississippi all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And that was before they had lightweight Mylar materials, ha-ha. Of course I've heard of him. And who would have been the victim, Boyer or Ducharme? Very possibly Boyer, said Miss Price. She peered at an old map covered with indecipherable markings, but on which the pear shape of Blue Lake was plainly visible. The murderer, Ducharme, might have buried him out of guilt. They were friends and early business partners in the fur trade with the Indians, after all. Or maybe he wanted to hide the evidence. Well, let's be fair to Ducharme. He might have been killed in self-defense. Most likely, Boyer's body was just left there to be consumed by wild animals. George shuddered. And that was a very long time ago, I take it, said Nan. George caught the hint of a tremor in her voice. Of course, Mrs. Fremont. The voyagers were active in the area from the mid-1600s all the way into the early 1800s. La Salle flourished in the late 1600s. This would have occurred around then. I would know. I have specialized in the study of the Livia area my entire adult life. Nan released her hunched-up shoulders. Well, I'm really relieved. When you first mentioned it, I thought you were talking about something that happened not all that long ago. Why, certainly not, Miss Price gasped. Most certainly not. This is a historical society, not the local constabulary. What, do you think French explorers and missionaries and fur traders were mucking around here after World War II? With maybe 100-power Evinrude outboard motors on their bark canoes and outfitted with breathable fabric anoraks and bazookas to ward off the bad old suburbanites? Nan jerked back from the counter at this sudden outburst. Well, when you first told us about murder, you didn't say right away when it was. And it's still a little unsettling to know someone might have been killed in your backyard, no matter when. Goodness. Some believe the spirit lives on, said Miss Price. Perhaps you'd better be mindful of that. Actually, said George, clearing his throat and glancing at Nan, whose pursed lips and unflinching stare he knew to be the signal to be resolute. We wanted to know if you had records of anything else buried there. Miss Price gave a start. Something buried, she said. Nan and George glanced at each other. A telepathic connection warned them to shift into evasive mode.
Oh, how
So
fun.
that lays the beginnings of this sort of mystery about what is underneath all these beautiful gardens that they've created.
I really like the juxtaposition of the mystery and the comedy. It's lots of fun because you don't know what's going to be on the next page.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that's what I hope to create, perhaps a little more in the sequel than I did in the first book. In the first book, there is sort of who's going to win the contest and look at what all these people are doing. In the second book, it is a little bit of a quasi-mystery thrown in and becomes a major part of the mix.
What do you have coming up the pike? You mentioned you're working on 2 novels. Can you tell us anything about those?
Yes, I can tell you something about it. In fact, the next book is not about gardening, neither is the one after that. The next book is a rather darker, more serious, still humor, but a satire of the newspaper business.
Okay.
Having been a newspaper reporter for 31 years, actually 35 years, I thought I might try my hand at that. It focuses on an editor who is a corrupt person in a community that is ruled by corruption, not in Minnesota, it's somewhere else. And it's set against the backdrop of a paper that's struggling for existence and will be sold in 3 months. So what we have here is a corrupt editor who's based his life on making money out of his ability to peddle his influence as an editor, suddenly faced with the possibility that, well, with the definite demise of his career and trying to figure out rather frantically what to do about it. He's a humorous character, so he's not meant to be a complete villain. In fact, he's trying in a way to walk the straight and narrow again. So we have that. That again is something that has a lot of twists and turns in it, and that my agent is reading right now and we're hoping to market. The next book after that is a book about a retired couple who become the victims of their obsessions that they develop in their adulthood, in their retirement age actually, that sort of are wonderful as obsessions can often be, and yet destructive to the relationship between the two of them. There again, I'm sort of veering off into a different direction as opposed to establishing a franchise for the gardening books that I have. I do, however, hope to come back to the Fremonts and maybe even Dr. Sprout at some point.
Oh, that would be fun. How do you work on 2 novels at once?
Very easily, just go from one manuscript to the other one.
Okay.
It's when you find a publisher, the publisher is not just interested in one book. My first book, my contract with Kensington, the publisher of these 2 books, was for 2 books. Publishers always want something in the pipeline. They want you to keep churning out books for them. For me as a journalist, I have no problem with that. So I naturally, as soon as I'm finished with one book, actually I usually take a break between one and the next. In this case, however, I was thinking ahead to needing to market another book at the time when Front Yard came out to have something ready to show someone. So I began working on the newspaper book. At the same time as that, once I had finished the first draft, I wanted to leave that aside and begin working on another book that I had told my agent about that I also wanted to do, and which a publisher had already expressed some interest in terms of the concept. So now you're actually, there is some overlap, but you're actually not quite working on, well, I guess you could work on one day and one the next. But one is awaiting the decision from my agent, which should be in a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. And as we have that little pause, I'm moving on to the next book and tackling the second draft of that. I've already finished the first draft.
Okay. We're drawing to the end of our time. Is there anything else you'd like to add that you'd like to share with our viewers?
Well, actually, I'm assuming that your viewers are readers, and I had a few recommendations for summer reading. I have them right here, if I could maybe get them and hold them up.
Sure.
This one is by William Trevor, who's one of my favorite authors of all time. He's an Anglo-Irish author, well into his 90s, I believe now. He's a literary writer, but don't let that scare you away, because he's very accessible with great plots, and his books are only about 200 to 230 pages. Next, this is by a writer, novelist named Paul Theroux, who actually became famous initially as a travel writer, a travel book writer, and became a novelist. If you've heard of the Mosquito Coast, which was made into a movie with Harrison Ford back in the 80s, Paul Theroux wrote the book on which that is based. If you remember the sort of chilling sort of sense of somebody being in a place where he shouldn't be, this book also is about that. But it is a fantastic read. I could not put it down. I neglected all kinds of duties to finish this book, and it, once again, not very long. My favorite humor writer, maybe of all time, P.G. Wodehouse. This is just one of many of P.G. Wodehouse's books you might want to read if you're, like I hope with Front Yard and Backyard, if you just want a light, breezy, fun read, this is your guy. He flourished from the 20s through the 50s.
Well, that's title.
Oh, the title is The Inimitable Jeeves. It's Bertie Wooster and Jeeves are the two main characters. There are many other Jeeves and Wooster books in this series. I think at least 7 or 8 of these books.
Okay. Well, that is very good to have some summer reads. I thank you for being with us. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I can't think of anything right offhand, but other than to thank you for having me here.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us at BookBeat. We look forward to seeing you next time.